Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for being here today on this beautiful summer day. We'll try and keep the lights low so that we can keep it at a reasonable temperature. My name is Galen Panger, and I'm co-director here at the Center for Technology, Society, and Policy at Berkeley, along with my colleague Nick Doty. We're thrilled to present Inclusive Technologies, Designing Systems to Support Diverse Bay Area Communities and Perspectives, featuring 3 of our collaborative teams here at the Center. Last November, after a pretty competitive application process, we announced our inaugural class of 28 fellows who are working together on 11 collaborative projects. And today we'll hear from 3 of these collaborative teams who are working in the areas of technology and well-being and digital citizenship. In just a few short months, they've engaged in research and have a number of interesting thoughts and findings to share with you today. So without further ado, let's welcome our fellows and invite Fan May up to the stage to get started. Thanks.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Fan Mai. I'm a sociologist who study in the intersection of technology, culture, and digital citizenship. I will also want to introduce my collaborator Rebecca Jablonski, who is unfortunately unable to present here due to a scheduling conflict. But we're very happy to continue their communications offline. And since this is an ongoing project, we will have our email address at the end of the slide. So to begin with, we would like to thank the center for giving us this opportunity. And we would like just to give a little bit idea about how things get started, right? This is basically what we propose to study in this project. We want to investigate how social media sites such as Nextdoor.com are being used for particularly civic engagement and solving local crimes. And what we did is qualitative interviews. Okay. With users of Nextdoor, people involved with local community, associations, and activist groups. Okay. Oh, this one? Oops. So not touching anything. All right. Shall we get started again? Okay. All right. Okay, there we go. Okay. All right. So I think that to begin with, it would be helpful to just give you a little bit background about what is Nextdoor and the kind of like the focus of research. So Nextdoor introduced itself as the private social network for neighborhoods. In order to join the network, people need to register with their real names and street address. So membership on Nextdoor is quite restrictive, and you need to go through a verification process because the company wants to make sure that only people who can prove that they are physical residents of a neighborhood can actually participate in the online community. Founded in 2010, Nextdoor is the first nationwide system that attempts to create a local social media experience for any neighborhood. According to recent public media sources, nearly 60% of neighborhoods in the United States have a Nextdoor group. By April 2014, 84% of neighborhoods in Oakland, where our research focused on, have a Nextdoor group. Now I would like to just highlight some features of Nextdoor platforms. The first feature we want to highlight is that Nextdoor pre-assigned categories to direct the usage of the website. When people post a message on Nextdoor, they will need to select a category from a list of choices such as classifieds, crime and safety, recommendations, etc. So in our research, we focus on the usage of crime and safety section. According to the source from Nextdoor, posting crime and safety sections actually count for a substantial amount of the overall usage of the website. In fact, public media and the company itself had referred to Nextdoor as the virtual neighborhood watch. Another important feature of Nextdoor is the nearby neighborhood, which allows users to participate in discussion not only from their own neighborhood, but also from a number of neighborhoods that are close by. As an illustration, so if you live in the orange area, you will be able to access your own area, but also the green areas that's surrounding it. So this feature amplifies the potential for people to interact in a more diverse environment. But at the same time, the nearby neighborhood feature also scale up the amount of online activities and contents to deal with, and also maybe conflict to deal with, as you would bet. So who are in charge of monitoring the contents on Nextdoor? People who play an important role in monitoring neighborhood contents are the neighborhood lead. Many of them were the founding members of the Nextdoor neighborhood websites, and the lead can remove messages, adjust neighborhood boundaries, verify new members, and add other members as the co-leads. The leads are also expected to handle conflict between neighbors on the Nextdoor websites. It is worth noting that although regular users can flag any messages they found problematic, it is up to the lead to decide whether to remove the message or not. And I hope this background information just gives you some idea about why we chose to study Nextdoor and what kind of media environment that contextualize the usage of their platform. So let's move on to go over the research questions and the method we've been using in this research. So we focused on 3 key questions. First, how does the demographic of a neighborhood influence the experience of neighborhood watch? Second, does a one-size-fits-all approach work for different types of users? Then we talk about how to improve the inclusiveness of the platform. So to answer these questions, we focus on 3 Oakland neighborhoods. And the first community is described as predominantly white with very high median household income and also very high adoption rate of Nextdoor. The second community is comparably more racially diverse with average household income, and the adoption rate is also a little bit over the average adoption rate in Oakland neighborhood, which is estimated to be 20%. Our third community is predominantly non-white with comparably lower household income and comparably higher crime rate. The adoption rate of Nextdoor is also the lowest in this community. But what these communities, 3 communities share in common is that they all located in urban areas and they all facing the issues of crime and safety and currently undergoing gentrification. Okay, so in this research, we recruit participants by reaching out to activist groups. We also conducted Nextdoor, we also contacted Nextdoor neighborhood leads to just learn about their own experience and ask them to post recruitment letters for interviews in their neighborhoods. We also attended offline neighborhood association meetings in 2 of our selected communities. And some of the participants are found through snowballing, which is referred by the past interviewees. I want to say that this research is still ongoing. So far, we have conducted 17 interviews with Nextdoor users. 5 of them are identified as Nextdoor neighborhood lead. We also conducted informational interviews with Oakland Police Department officers and local activists. So we're going to present our preliminary findings in the following three things. First, we discussed the value of free speech and open communities among Nextdoor users. Second, we discussed how users from diverse backgrounds resolve conflicts. Then we discussed how different user types participate in different ways. One thing we found from our interviews is that people don't want to censor each other's posts. Even though flagging is a key option enabled by the platform for the users to deal with any problematic post, many participants of our study do not like using that feature to stifle the conversation on Nextdoor. A woman from the community that is predominantly white admitted that she found the discussion of white privilege to be uncomfortable. As a white person, she said she sometimes felt personally attacked by this kind of discussion, but she does not want to use flagging to censor the discussion because she's a big proponent of the First Amendment. An African-American man from the community that is racially diverse has been very outspoken about racial inequality online. He shared an article about gentrification and got flagged by other users. He interpreted flagging as a subtle cyberbullying. What made him feel upset was not because of the conflict or disagreement itself, but the action of flagging as a way, according to him, of avoid having a conversation. Even though our research focused on Nextdoor, we also learned about what other communication technologies the local communities had used or currently use besides Nextdoor. We found that 2 of the 3 communities had been using Yahoo groups for Neighborhood Watch for many, many years before Nextdoor became more popular. One community with dominantly non-white residents adopt a private Facebook group. Some members of this community use both Nextdoor and Facebook, but they indicated in the interview that they actually prefer Facebook over Nextdoor because Facebook allows people to form a more selective groups. For example, here's a quote from a member of the community with predominantly non-white residents. This respondent is white himself. He says, "I know a lot of people who post on Facebook personally. Some of the same people are on Nextdoor, but we use word of mouth. Nextdoor uses the mailing address so they could get a different set of folks. Facebook people pretty much self-selected and joined because of word of mouth, while the Nextdoor people are marketed to directly. Overall, we found Nextdoor has a broader user base compared to other online neighborhood groups, which lead to our second theme on diversity. So we found racial inclusiveness on Nextdoor was actually a more prominent thing in this racially diverse community, but was rarely mentioned by members of the more homogeneous communities we conducted research. So only 2 out of the 6 participants in the predominantly white neighborhoods mentioned racial inclusiveness on Nextdoor when we asked about what kind of posts they found problematic or controversial, and what kind of issues, what are the top issues are facing the community. In contrast, everyone we interviewed in the racially diverse community mentioned racial inclusiveness in the discussion. Somewhat to our surprise that actually none of the people we interviewed in the predominantly non-white community mentioned racial inclusiveness in the discussion. The next thing is that the discussion about racial inclusiveness in those racially diverse community actually serve to bring people together. Here's a quote from a neighborhood lead. She said, "You can choose to try to silence posters because what they say make others uncomfortable, but I don't believe that's a good idea. We should feel uncomfortable with institutionalized racism. Being uncomfortable leads to growth." And here's another quote from a neighborhood lead in the racially diverse community, talking about how she's able to meet a lot of people because of the discussion of racial profiling initiated on Nextdoor. The third thing we want to further the discussion about diversity is that we found that just having the conversations online might not be enough to resolve the conflict. Actually, it was bringing the conversation into what we call the private sphere, or taking those conversations offline to a face-to-face level was crucial in actually resolving differences and conflict. So here's a quote from a neighborhood lead who's talking about how she was able to persuade a user to drop the racially loaded term on Nextdoor by approaching him through private messaging. Here's another quote from an African-American man who started to organize workshops in his neighborhood to address racial issues. He says, "If I see somebody getting beat up by a lot of people about a racist post, and it looked like the person has gone silent, then I would definitely private message them. I don't want the person who made the post when it was maybe a teachable moment to not get that teachable moment. So I would PM them, and I would definitely invite them to the workshop." Okay, moving on. We found that there are some specific user type particularly relevant to our research. The first type is the people who are actively involved with neighborhood associations and acting as neighborhood leads offline. But to our surprise, many of them are not necessarily serving as the neighborhood lead on Nextdoor. In fact, some of them even resist the idea to become the lead for the Nextdoor neighborhoods. And we would like to find out why. And for example, a member of the racially diverse community who is in charge of organizing offline neighborhood meetings, he talked positively about the lead of his Nextdoor neighborhood and the platform in general. But he also indicated he's not interested to become a lead himself. What he wants to become is what he called a social justice lead on Nextdoor, so that he can go beyond his own community to talk to a broader audience about issues related to racial justice. In other words, he wants to play a leadership role, but not defined by a physical community, but defined by a specific issue, which is racial justice in this case. Some community leaders who are long-term residents of their neighborhoods are very wary, actually, of the usage of social media. For example, the chair of a neighborhood association said, "I don't see the purpose of telling the entire neighborhood and nearby neighborhood about someone's house got broken into on Nextdoor. If you know your neighbor, you will know when something is not right." Another special user of Nextdoor is the police officer. Including the Oakland Police Department, more than 1,000 law enforcement agencies across the country have adopted Nextdoor. Based on the feedback we heard from the OPD officer, they were actually very optimistic about the use of social media for civic engagement, even though the online participation is kind of quite limited. And this is partly because the public agency accounts on Nextdoor does not really give them the access to internal neighborhood conversations. In fact, the potential to monitor neighborhood conversation are the major concerns people had when OPD initiated the partnership with Nextdoor, because they were worried that Nextdoor would become a tool for police surveillance if the police officers have full access. What Nextdoor provides, according to the community resource officer in one of our selected community, is an informal channel to let people voice their concern and interact with each other. Posting on Nextdoor does not count as official report of crimes, and it is not common for people to use social media to directly demand service from the police officer. So one of the most striking things we found about our participants was that people were open to the discussion of controversial issues. They might feel uncomfortable to speak up. They might disagree with each other, but most of them support the usage of Nextdoor for discussing civic issues. For example, people found posts of racial profiling to be controversial and hurtful, but the awareness and the discussion it generates was described as fantastic teachable moment by many participants. As we described earlier, the conversation about implicit racial biases might bring people together. Because lots of people found there's not enough safe space online and offline to openly discuss the issue with each other. So one of the implications that we draw from this is that instead of mainly focus our attention on preventing or silencing the controversies and conflicts online, it is equally important, or even I would say more important, to consider how we can encourage the constructive discussion of sensitive issues on Nextdoor and other social media. Okay, I will leave you from here and switch to the next thing. But these are our emails, and if you want to have a conversation, please reach out. This research is still ongoing. Thank you very much. Oh, shall we do that right now? Okay. Yeah. Okay, just.
Any questions while the next presentation is going? You have, like, if the cop is a neighbor, then is there any, like, if the cop lives in the neighborhood and he gets access to the Nextdoor, he or she gets access to the Nextdoor site, is there any possibility that there could be some, like, not surveillance by the whole police department, but I just wonder if that role is not, like, cops aren't only cops, but also neighbors.
Can you answer on the microphone? That would be super helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay, so basically there are like two kinds of accounts, right? They can register as regular users, but only to the actual neighborhood they live in for the police officers. And in order to like covering what they call the community they're serving, which is a wider area, they need to register what is called the public agency account, which only gives them very limited access to those neighborhoods they're targeting. And actually, we have been asking, would they prefer to have more access? And many of them said they would. it's okay that they don't have the full access. First of all, they're talking about how the OPD is understaffing. So they said they probably don't have that many people and energy to really follow up on those discussions, even though they're so important. And the second, it is what illustrated in the second quote is that they always say, they're saying that it is actually a good way for the community to just talk behind the doors so that the people feel that the voice are heard, but also feel safe and not being surveillanced. Yeah. Okay. Hope that answered your question. Yes.
More comment.
Yeah.
I participated both in the Nextdoor system since it started, I think, 4 or 5 years ago in Albany, and also I participated in the Albany Patch newspaper system. And I have found that Nextdoor just feels too unfocused. It's been difficult to set the proper messaging notifications. I've had to fall back on doing the daily digest as opposed to getting individual subjects, because I just get flooded uncontrollably with messages coming in that I don't want. And whereas the Albany patch system depended on, which was a completely open system, depended on comments based on actual newspapers, stories that, generated about the community, and that they were much more intense and interesting discussions that came out, as opposed to what happens on Nextdoor, which is just it's just a kind of a pass. I assume these neighborhood leads are not paid, or are they paid?
All of those neighborhood leads are volunteers, and they're not affiliated with the company. And sometimes they are becoming their lead by surprise, like they found out they were the first one who signed up for the neighborhood and ultimately become the lead. And actually they have to contact Nextdoor if they don't want to become the lead, right? And a lot of people wouldn't bother to do that. So yeah, they're volunteers and they're not associated with Nextdoor. And I think only recently the Nextdoor has been offered kind of like training for those lead in Oakland, which happened, I think, last Monday. I don't know how many people were able to went to a Monday training meeting, but when we're doing the interviews, people were talking about there was not a lot of resources or information guidelines other than what they are accessed online. So yeah, and then reflecting to what your previous comments, we also heard a lot of people complaining that like it's very hard for using this platform to focus on specific issues, but they also feel overwhelmed and flooded by the messages that are quite random, and they also talk about they would want something, maybe they're not sure whether it should be a different section or it just should be somewhere that people have the expectation they can post news articles or like a point of entering those, like what we talk about civic issues, right? And I think that in one of the quotes we used that it was an African-American male who actually used a news article about gentrification to try to generate a conversation, but unfortunately it got flagged, which said that it's inappropriate to discuss this kind of question under crime and safety, which he is feeling very confused about. Yeah. So just to reflect on what you said.
I think if you had people leading these discussions who were motivated and talented, but that probably means having to pay, some kind of incentive. But I think these kinds of groups need some kind of a spur and some kind of cohesiveness that I don't think it self-organizes well. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it's not like organically rolled out of the community, but more of like a business model developed by the company. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you for the questions.
All right, I want to thank Nick and Galen for helping us organize all of this. I really appreciate it. My name is Morgan Ames. I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been working on with Jenna Burrell, who couldn't be here, and Jonas, who is here in the front row here. and Catherine Lowe, who is actually now doing an internship in England, so she sadly also couldn't be here. And this is a larger project exploring sort of ideas, technological imaginaries, and technological futures in Richmond. Richmond is, there we go. Richmond is just north of Berkeley. It goes Berkeley, El Cerrito, Albany's there, and then Richmond. It's very close as well to Silicon Valley, centers of great wealth, but in many ways it's very peripheral in terms of the access and culture that is available within Richmond proper. Many residents of Richmond feel like Silicon Valley is a very distant world of which they are not a part. And at the same time, there are a lot of new tech initiatives within the Richmond area. There's a one-to-one laptop program. There are a number of very tech-heavy charter schools. There's a new makerspace that Chevron funded for $3 million in one of the high schools there. And so there's a lot of utopianism around what tech is meant to do in this community. So we were attracted to the area because of this really interesting juxtaposition, this feeling of removal from the tech center, which is very close by, and yet all of these really interesting initiatives. We ended up focusing in on the school systems in particular, and the Richmond School District, which is now called West Contra Costa Unified School District, is one that has struggled a lot of late, especially in the last 20 years. It's on somewhat of an upswing, even though its enrollment has actually been dropping. 72% of its kids qualify as low income, and this includes several wealthy areas around, so the numbers within Richmond proper are actually much higher. It's 52% Latino, Latina, 20% African American. 30% of the kids within Richmond proper have no internet connection, and this is, you can compare this to 16% nationally, and only 50% currently use computers regularly. Of course, this will change when the one-to-one laptop program comes out, but we're really interested in understanding what a baseline is as well. Where are these kids coming from, and what does technology mean to them right now? So this research project had a couple components. One was following up on a Minecraft camp that we actually ran last summer. Part of this was doing some interviews, which we did in January, February. We've done data analysis February through April, and we're currently writing up a paper we'll be submitting to computer-supported cooperative work. And we're going to be running a new Minecraft workshop this summer as well, a Minecraft camp. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. We also ran a girls' code workshop. This was at Kennedy High School. We spent January, February planning, ran it in March over 4 weeks. We did a number of interviews with participants in April, and we're just starting with data analysis. And because of that, I'm going to talk more about the Minecraft camp and less about the girls' code, just because we're still kind of working through what we saw and what it means for the girls' code. This is also part of a larger landscape, or a larger research initiative. We've been attending the technology subcommittee meetings of the district, and in particular has been doing a lot of those this year. And we've been attending one-to-one laptop planning meetings and some other kind of district events around the laptop program in particular. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Minecraft just for those of you who aren't familiar with it. Minecraft is often called virtual Legos. It's a blocky game. It's called Minecraft because both mining resources and crafting them into more complex resources is a big part of the game. Also part of the game is farming, building big buildings, crafting already, and in certain modes of the game, fighting. This is not all modes of the game. In creative mode, there isn't much fighting. But in player versus player and survival modes, which are the two lower images here, there can potentially be a fair amount of fighting, and the idea is sort of fostering friendly competition. The camps that we ran were using a framework out of UC Irvine called Connected Camps. Now this is a model that uses connected learning as its base. The idea is that you immerse these kids in a world that they find personally meaningful, that they find kind of personally fulfilling, and that is a very good basis for learning. If they're in a world where they don't feel comfortable, it's not a very good place to really learn something at a deep level. So Connected Camps also had full-time camp counselors, virtual camp counselors in this world all the time, and they were interacting with the kids. We were also there in person with them. We ran an affiliate camp in Richmond City Hall. They have a great tech training room that was basically vacant during the month of July and will be again this coming July, so we'll be there again. And they're on a fiber backbone, which is great for Minecraft. You can run on a pretty low powered machine, but it's really good to have fast internet. We ran July 6th through 31st last summer, 4 weeks, 2 hours a day. We were targeting kids 8 to 13 in this camp. So this is kind of junior high school kids, a few elementary school kids as well. Connected Camps had a number of challenges that were geared towards education, so they had coordinated builds, they had group explorations through the world, and they had various friendly competitions, which I'll talk more about in just a moment. So I'm going to go into some of the findings that we saw, some of the observations we had, and talk about their implications. The first was a number of observations around access, around abilities, around self-selection in this camp. We found that nearly all of our campers came into this camp with pretty limited computer and internet access at home. Most of them had a game console, most of their parents had a mobile phone with some mobile internet access, but few of them had working computers, few of them had internet other than through a mobile device. Their engagement with computers in particular was often limited to computerized testing in schools. So they did not have a very positive relationship with computers coming into this. Only 1/4 of our campers had ever played Minecraft on a PC before, and a lot of that was, when they were visiting somebody. Most of them played on either on a mobile phone, what's called Personal Edition, or on one of their game consoles. And the significant thing about this is that Minecraft is much more limited in what you can do in both the Personal Edition and on game consoles. You can't install mods. The multiplayer options are much more limited. You can just put people on the same local network, but you're not meeting people from around the world. You're not having a kind of rich interactive experience like you would on the Connected Camp server. We found also that among our campers, there was also some issues with literacy. And some of this was that there were some young kids, but also in Richmond more generally, literacy tends to be a little bit lower. Kids tend to be a grade or two behind, on average, behind where they should be reading-wise in school. And part of this is because there are so many bilingual households that these kids are really struggling to learn a whole new language. This manifested in various ways during camp. One thing was that various keyboard skills had to be learned. There are a number of kids who couldn't quite make sense of the shift key, for example. Like you have to hold it down while you hit something else. It's not how online or on-screen keyboards tend to work. They tended to ignore and be very slow in chat, which had cultural consequences I'll talk about in a moment. There wasn't very much familiarity with the norms of multiplayer servers, which ends up being important for how kids interact. Unfortunately, almost nobody could continue playing on this multiplayer server after camp ended. We provided installation instructions. They had free access to the server and to these Minecraft accounts, but most of them still didn't have computers and internet at home, so this was not something they were able to take forward in their lives. At the same time, we did find that among many of our kids, parents were very involved and very interested in their education. 50% of our kids were in charter schools. Compare that to 10% of the Richmond population more generally. And all of the families that we interviewed afterwards had very high aspirations for their kids. They definitely wanted their kids to go to college. They wanted them to have professional careers. And this is despite a lot of historical and ongoing traumas that are connected to immigration, connected to racism, connected to poverty in the area. So I think that it's really significant to highlight, there's a self-selection that goes on in these kinds of events that, that mean that you are reaching kids who maybe are already a little bit more engaged than some of their peers. So I want to talk a bit about one of our first findings that we discovered the first couple days of camp. Most of our kids were Black and Latina, and they all wanted to change their avatar. So there's this default avatar when you go into Minecraft. It's a white dude, his name is Steve, and none of the kids wanted this avatar. It was the mark of a noob. So, so they all got on this Minecraft, it's called Skindex, this index of Minecraft skins, and they all started looking for avatars that looked kind of like themselves. And nobody was able to find one that looked like themselves. There were no brown or black skinned avatars. We helped a few of our campers make their own. They manually edited the pixels, and in fact, one of them was holding up her hand to match, which I just thought was like, wow, that's pretty evocative right there. A lot of the boys actually ended up choosing to be pieces of bacon or tacos or minions or various other characters, of which there were many within the Minecraft database. But the normalcy of whiteness among these skins, I think, was very telling about who was expected in the game. There was also a choice of activities that reflected middle-class sensibilities and cultural touchstones in various ways. And this is on a server that was trying very hard to be inclusive. So Connected Camps wanted to reach out. They actively supported our affiliates camp. We were able to enroll all these kids for free. Yet they had things like a Harry Potter build, and none of our kids had any interest in Harry Potter. None of them had read the books or seen the movies. There was more recently build a police station and police force, and this was after the camp ended, but I can imagine that might be somewhat triggering for some Richmond kids who've had some run-ins with authorities who maybe haven't been very respectful of them. So I think there's a kind of reflection of a middle-class sensibility within some of the activities on the server as well. Another cultural thing came up around chat. So I mentioned that a lot of the kids within Richmond more generally are a little bit below grade level on reading. Many of them hadn't really interacted much with a keyboard before, and many of them started out just completely ignoring chat. So chat is sort of ongoing within the world. It's the main way most of the people on the server talk to one another because they're all logging in from home. But we were all in the same room together, and so our kids were talking verbally, they were negotiating things, you know, there'd be a fight and one character would die in the world and come back and there'd be a negotiation like, give me back my stuff. But none of this was reflected online. Our kids were seen as very quiet. They kept to themselves, the counselors later said. And there were some misunderstandings due to ignoring chat. So kids would take things that weren't theirs, that they didn't realize. They'd be told in chat to give it back. They wouldn't see the chat. And so there were some like teleports to cool down areas because of this. Our campers' accomplishments also tended not to be highlighted in the weekly events because they ended up being most interested in player versus player mode. There's nothing really, you know, there's sort of only ephemeral results from that. You win a competition and then you go on to the next competition. Whereas the highlights tended to be large pixel art that had kind of clever cultural references. And again, this sort of reflected a different cultural expectation among the campers. There were also some assumptions around parental involvement. So our position as in-person counselors during the camp also blurred into acting at times as surrogate parents, which again highlighted certain expectations regarding player location and parental involvement. So there was an example of two players, actually it's not these players, but we'll pretend it's these two players, who have very similar screen names. And they were both kind of exploring the limits of the server's rules. They were, you know, taking things, maybe exploring spaces that weren't theirs. And they were both separately warned, but one of the counselors conflated them and banned one of them for 24 hours, saying, you need to bring your parents in and talk through the rules before you can get back on. But her parents were in no position to talk through the rules with her. They spoke Spanish only, the rules were in English, and they were not very technologically fluent. They told us that they weren't comfortable with computers, they hadn't used computers much. So we had to jump in and talk through the rules with her and then catch her mom up during pickup. There are other instances, a lot of instances of parental involvement that showed up the counselor logs for Connected Camps. And parental involvement is generally very common and sometimes required within Minecraft more generally. So installing mods on Minecraft, for example, is a fairly complex process. As one gets older and more technically sophisticated, one can do it oneself. But when one is fairly young, it helps a lot, and in fact is possibly a requirement for some to have a fairly technologically literate parent to access that kind of world. So again, this is a case within Minecraft of some norms around parental involvement, excluding certain kinds of population from play. And finally, I wanted to talk just a bit about gender. Minecraft is often talked about as a very gender-neutral game. There's a lot made of the girls who do play Minecraft. We heard a lot of stories that girls are just as interested in boys in Minecraft. Despite that, though, we very actively recruited for girls, and we enrolled all the girls who were interested in the camp. And even then, we only had 39% participation of girls in the camp. The best stats, so there aren't really good statistics Minecraft-wide. Estimates vary from 10% to 40% participation of women. Many educators point to the 40% range and say, look, this is pretty good, right? I'm personally rather troubled by this because Minecraft is still within this broader gaming culture, which has been very masculinized. In fact, was actively masculinized in the 1980s. And I think in order to push back against the sexism that comes up in multiplayer gaming communities and in the online spaces more generally, we need to do better even than 40%. A few token girls really won't change the tide. So there's some implications for this. There's assumptions about who the typical Minecraft player is, even on a server that's actively trying to be inclusive. Those assumptions generally trend towards them being white, them being male, and them being middle or upper middle class. And I say middle or upper middle class because it reflects assumptions about middle class parenting styles. Annette Leroux found that middle class parents tend to have very high parental involvement. She called their parenting style concerted cultivation. And other classes don't necessarily follow that. Lower classes tend to follow what she termed the natural growth model, where parenting comes naturally, kids will naturally kind of become who they will be as adults. And certainly parents in that class want to give their kids opportunities, but it isn't this kind of fraught, anxious experience that it sometimes turns into for the middle class. There's also, as I mentioned, there's a legacy of actively targeting this demographic in the 1980s, and I think it continues to have implications today in rather sexist, racist, and classist trends in the technology world more generally. You look who's employed in the technology world. For so many people, gaming has been a gateway into becoming a techie. And if Minecraft is going to train the next generation of hackers, which many people are saying it will, evidence suggests that it's best to, that it's really primed to recreate these gender, racial, and class dynamics that are already present and very problematic in the industry. This doesn't mean that all is lost, though. Again, though, this won't change without active effort. Our own efforts are to actively include marginalized populations and to really be open with them about the sorts of issues that come up in these worlds. Broader efforts towards activism and social justice in these worlds are fairly nascent, but I think are growing. And I feel like it might be a rough road ahead, but I think that it's very worth fighting this fight. And with that, I thank you, and I'll open up for a couple of questions. Any questions? I know it was a quick.
I have time for questions.
Yeah, sure.
So just hearing about computer use and things like the keyboard, that was something I hadn't considered. But I'm also curious about the actual substance of the game and what, maybe what you're expecting students to learn or what you're seeing about what students learn. Are the participants like creating complex machinery in the game? Are they playing with the sort of programming concepts of like lights that turn on and railroad cars that move, or is it much more focused on battle or
Building
play?
battles.
Yeah.
I think it varied a lot. By the way, are you next? Do you want to set up? We can share a little bit. So because this camp was aimed at somewhat younger kids, we thought of the skills that they were gaining more as pre-coding skills. This summer we're actually going to be running a Minecraft coding camp where kids are, we're going to be installing mods, we have it's sort of a mashup between Turtle Graphics and Minecraft that we're going to be doing. So I'll be able to say more to this then. The idea behind connected learning is that having these kind of safe and positive spaces to explore is good scaffolding into learning more technical skills. And we certainly saw some technical growth during the camp, but it wasn't of the programming sort, at least for these kids. So here's the mic. I think it's on. They're just collecting it over there.
I'm just curious about, do you do any follow-up? As you mentioned that most of the kids cannot get access to play that after your intervention. And I have heard about a lot of this kind of a research programming intervention just come to for a short period of time and then they left. And it actually create a very negative impact for the intervention groups, because they seem that you come here to do an intervention, get the result, and then left them without anything. So I don't know, do you think about that? And
all the time. I think it's a big concern. I personally feel like a 4-week workshop or camp isn't going to radically transform a kid's life, especially when they return to the same conditions that they were. We did follow up in January, and we intend to be involved in this community long term. So we're going to be running Minecraft camps again this summer. We're going to be working with the school districts around possibly integrating this or other models into after-school clubs or even into classroom activities. So I think there's some opportunities for long-term engagement, but that said, I share your skepticism that these things can make differences. I mean, I think that many of them might be incremental steps towards positive social change, but I don't think there's any magic bullet, unfortunately. There's nothing that's going to magically transform these. If anything, I think about these workshops as opportunities for giving back to the community in a way. So I'm not just going in and doing a bunch of interviews and leaving and kind of doing extractive research. I'm doing these workshops that the kids were very clearly very interested in. And they become a research probe in themselves in a lot of ways. So complicated though. Yeah, I think the activism efforts have been kind of a little bit scattershot. The avatar thing I'm not sure about. I have seen a little bit more diversity more recently. Part of it is just that many of the avatars end up being pop culture references, and so like Hulk Hogan is one. Well, he is a person of color. I don't know if all kids want to be Hulk Hogan, but it's an option. So there are some more lately than there were before. I think more generally there's a number of camps like Connected Camps that we partnered with, like Hack the Hood or Black Girls Code or some of these others that aren't Minecraft related necessarily, but are more interested in sort of changing the camber of who's participating in technology realms more generally. I think is it quick? We could, I don't know how we're doing on. Go for it. Okay.
It's just about the broad range of Richmond's technology features. Like I heard Richmond is one of the sponsors of some of these maker spaces, and so I just wondered if there's a conversation, maybe in some of the district meetings you're going to or elsewhere outside of the workshop, about kind of old technology and new technology, and also just the incredible citizen science and environmental justice activism that goes on there.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly technological scientific literacy.
Yeah, and Anne might be able to speak to this a bit too, but.
I think in the limited number of technology subcommittee meetings I go to, one of the things that we've talked about is the people who are there are people who are very supportive of, in particular, the laptop distribution program, and that's really a focus for them, is how to use the laptops and what kind of programs are available and accessible and how that changes their classroom practice. some of that is technologies to enable what you're talking about and more broader pedagogical processes like discussions and debates and science projects and everything that's out there. So I think that is absolutely that kind of technology as infrastructure part is definitely that at least that group of people are talking about, with the caveat that that's like one particular set of people.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Oh yeah, great.
Thank you. I'm going to turn this just a little bit so it's more, okay. Great. Well, thank you to the two other groups who've already presented, and again, of course, to Galen and Nick, our co-organizers here. So thank you all for coming. My name is Kristen Barta. I'm a graduate student at the University of Washington in communication. This is my colleague, Robin Perry, who is a graduate of Berkeley's own iSchool. And not with us today is Margaret Fesenmeyer, Maggie. She couldn't be here, unfortunately, due to a teaching conflict. But we are from the Migrant Wellbeing and Technology Project. And we are investigating how migrant women in the Bay Area and in Seattle are using communication technologies to leverage social support networks here and abroad. So what we'd like to do today is present a few interesting findings that are emerging from our project as we're continuing our data collection and analysis. So to preview, our big question here, thank you. There we go. Is how are immigrant women in the U.S. accessing social support via technology? And we're addressing this question by conducting interviews again in the Bay Area and in Seattle.
So we're interviewing in two groups. We're interviewing immigrant women, very broadly defined, but trying to narrow it to women who have been here between 1 and 7 years. We've stretched that frame a little bit bigger to include people who have been here even longer. And we're also interviewing women, oh, thank you, sorry.
I need to move, but okay.
Yeah, maybe that's
Oh, okay, maybe I'll do that. Thanks. We're also interviewing staff at immigrant service provider organizations and really considering a broad range of what immigrant service provision is. Today we're going to focus on the immigrants that immigrant interviews that we're working through. As another group mentioned, we're sort of just getting our heads around everything we're learning from this first set of interviews, and we have a lot more service provider interviews to do. So to give you a little sense, we did this visual of folks, the immigrant women we've been interviewing. So the idea is that the red footprints are, each one represents someone who's been here under 5 years. Green, they've been here a little bit longer, and then blue, even longer. And as you can see, we're starting to get some clusters, and that's what we were really going for. East Africa is a cluster, South America, the Middle East, East Asia, and then some in Europe as well. This is you.
So thank you, Robin. No, it's okay. So before we preview some of the findings that we're working through, there are a few basic assumptions that are guiding and shaping our project. So just to preview those for you right now. The first assumption is that our interviewees, our participants, own or have access to communication technologies. And we're finding that we have a bit of an overrepresentation of individuals who are from high education or high economic backgrounds. And so we're finding that many people have access to kind of more gadgety technologies like iPads, tablets, things like that. But we are finding that at a basic level, all of our interviewees, regardless of their background, have at least had access to a mobile communication technology. So a cell phone, in some cases a smartphone. The second assumption is that these individuals are accessing social support through their gadgets. And we have a few quotes and findings that speak to that assumption as well that we'll go through in a moment. And finally, that there are gaps that need to be addressed in these social support systems. That there is a limitation to what service providers can provide these communities. There's a limitation to what migrants themselves can access through their networks. And that we're trying to really focus in on those gaps and propose a solution that addresses those spaces. Thank you. So to address kind of the first assumption here that our participants are accessing social support, this is kind of one example here. And so we honed in here on an example of someone who is reported using immigrant forums to access informational support. So we're seeing not only informational support, but emotional support, tangible support. And in this case, she's talking about getting information to help her fill out kind of forms for immigration, right? Some legal assistance. Thank you. And to address kind of the second point here that gaps do exist, we're finding that in addition to kind of the basic human needs of shelter, financial mobility, housing, things like that, there are a lot of kind of more, mundane is a term we've been using, I don't want to use that in a prejudiced way, but kind of more mundane needs or kind of more routine or everyday needs that are not being addressed. And so kind of the difficulty of gaining cultural literacy and joining a new culture, not having enough time to make meaningful social connections when you're not from that area, language barriers, and other things that aren't particular to the migration experience, things like racism and sexism. And so this is another example that speaks to kind of that tension and that struggle. This is an individual who identifies stressors in understanding kind of how to navigate the cultural systems in place here. And so understanding kind of what do I maintain from my home culture, what do I need to let go of, and what do I need to learn to really succeed and be able to navigate these systems here. And she's proposed actually therapy as a solution to this stressor. And so this is how we're seeing kind of both the gaps in support provision and in areas for an increase in those services. And so another theme that we're seeing is the importance of maintaining kind of mundane communication with family and friends who may be here, but in most cases are often distant geographically. And so this points to the concept of co-presence, or the idea of using communication technologies to facilitate feelings of togetherness without actually requiring physical togetherness. And so this has the effect of bridging distances and maintaining those relationships. And we all do this. These are things like, poking your friend on Facebook, posting a photo, snapping something that you see, posting your lunch to Instagram so your friends can know that you're keeping up with your diet, whatever it is, right? So this is one example of how meaningful technology is in maintaining that co-presence for our participants. Another concept that we're seeing highlighted in these findings is that co-presence is something that is afforded. It's made available in varying degrees by communication technologies. And one particular affordance that we've pulled out here is the idea of synchronous communication. So synchronous communication is what happens when you have a face-to-face conversation, right? It happens in real time. And that's afforded by things like video chat, even texting if the person that you're responding or texting with is really responsive. And so we're seeing that co-presence is facilitating comfort. It's facilitating these feelings of being close to somebody. So in this case, we have a participant who's describing talking to her mom on Skype, and her mom wants to feel close to her as well and to feel close to her grandchildren. So she just leaves Skype up on a tablet and watches the children play, and it's like being there with them. And so what we're finding, though, is that beyond this immediate comfort that's facilitated through mundane communication, people often aren't reaching out to distant loved ones for social support, even though they have this co-presence. So the question becomes, when there are decreasing technical barriers to communication and closeness, why don't people reach out to loved ones to get that support for problems happening here?
So one thing we're finding is that a lot of folks, we've found a pattern of women saying, I don't tell certain loved ones, and some people they've said, this is the closest person to me in my life, that's someone I talk to all the time. I don't want to tell my mom about some stress that's happening in my life because she can't do anything anyway. And so we've seen this over and over again, particularly in the couple relationship. If there's any difficulty in the relationship that they might have here that their mom is aware of, they don't share because the mom knows the husband or partner is the only person they have here as a social supporter. so just a couple more examples. Yeah, I think this is where she says, so I never share, if I have an argument with my husband, I never share that with her because he's the only person I have here, and if she thinks we're not fine, she'd be really worried. So what we're starting to see is that, and really quick, a caveat is, like, I don't want to say that the best service, like, housing, legal services are not important. Of course they are, but we're focusing on social support. And so in terms of social support services, we found a couple of patterns. Informal cultural ambassadors are extremely important, and finding people in similar circumstances in whatever way, sort of finding a mirror of yourself in someone else that is here. So in terms of cultural ambassadors, one woman has a mother-in-law that's also an immigrant, so she highlights here the cultural brokering that she does to when this person arrives to help her navigate a lot of systems. And of course these logistics are very important, but from the context of the interview, it really felt like it was like someone's taking care of me. So it's informational, but it's like there's a bigger picture beyond that. Another thing we're interested in looking at as we get deeper into our data is that there's pretty interesting differences. Some women have come with a person, their partner from their country, and some have come and been received by their partner who is a citizen here, or they're both immigrants from different places together, and there's some interesting differences. So what this person is expressing how helpful it is to, and how big of an advantage it is to come to someone to have sort of a ready-made family and cultural place here upon arrival. And then speaking to finding sort of the mirror of yourself in the world, one thing that was really interesting is one interviewee talked about WeChat, which is the Chinese social network that she used to find people in the Bay Area who are other Chinese women immigrants with new infants. So I found that to be a pretty interesting, not necessarily reaching back to China to find support there, but finding a kinship with people who are exactly in the same circumstance that you are. And similar with somebody who is from South America in the second quote, as a first step, looking for the Facebook group, people from this country in the Bay Area, to just find those people who are like you, and maybe not all of them, but you'll find somebody in that. That's a first filter, right? And then sort of the expression that we've seen in other places about feeling more kinship with people who are from your place of origin because you're both here. Maybe you wouldn't connect as much with those people back at home, but you do more so here. And touching on the racism piece that we hope to dig more into as we cull through our data, the experience of an immigrant who was a student here and especially found it important to connect with people in the Black Student Union at this very white university. So this isn't necessarily an experience that's limited to immigrants, but it certainly became really important for her. Is this your piece? Yeah.
So the examples that we've shared and kind of the broader idea that both kind of cultural literacy and people with similar experiences are very helpful points to the broader tension between kind of acculturation and assimilation. And this is something we were seeing again and again as our participants are kind of negotiating their identity in this new space. And this is an ongoing process, of course. Someone we spoke to recently mentioned that it takes decades for someone in this country to feel at home here. So it's an ongoing negotiation, and we'd like to just point out the difference between these two concepts. So acculturation refers to the changes that groups and individuals undergo when they come in contact with a different culture, and it's this kind of idealistic two-way process in which both cultures are ultimately changed in a collaborative manner. Versus assimilation, which indicates that it's important for someone coming into a new culture to kind of blend in completely. And oftentimes that means giving up parts of yourself that are very important and very entrenched in cultural knowledge and cultural importance. So this is something that we're seeing arise again and again. Here's one example of someone kind of grappling with this right now, where she's expressing that she finds having a community of peers, people from her country, people like her, very, very comforting, but that the downside is that she didn't force herself to learn America in her terms. And so there's kind of a negotiation that, again, goes on, a struggle here that we're seeing. And so as we move forward with our interviews, we're hoping to keep this in mind and kind of continue to figure out strategies for negotiating this that are ultimately meaningful and feel comfortable for our participants, that can also be activated by and kind of continued by service providers who are already engaging with these communities.
So, as we've alluded, we'll be finishing immigrant service provider interviews, and we've been lucky enough to interview folks from staff at both county agencies and nonprofits, so as well as within the range of direct services provision, advocacy and policy work, and leadership development and organizing. So there's really a range of what these organizations see as necessary for integration or to support these communities. And hopefully we'll get to a sense of finding what these gaps are between what women are saying that they would really like to see more of, and what provision is possible. And I'd like to stress that we're not coming at this as to develop something where we turn to the service providers and say, you guys aren't doing this enough or well enough. They've really expressed that they'd love to have this white paper to point to say, to funders and to others to say, like, here, this corroborates what we have already known intuitively or in the on-the-ground work that we've done. So we're really striving to create something that is collaborative with them, not sort of like admonishing. And that's it. There's Maggie. So thanks.
Any questions?
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. The first question is, these are immigrant communities mostly. Did you look at immigrants who are not literate, and how were they interacting with these IT technologies? Because almost all IT technologies pretty much require that you're literate.
That's a good question. All of the people we've interviewed so far have a high degree of literacy. We have been interviewing a couple of service providers who serve communities that are less literate. Interestingly, there was one group that mostly communicates with their community with phones, not even texting, because they're not very literate, although they still see the potential to use more creative, different kinds of technology to support them. So we haven't interviewed folks. Part of the barrier for us is finding those people and figuring out how to interview more people who cover a broader range.
Because I think there's been some work done in India, I think, trying to build IT technologies via cell phone that are entirely based on voice response.
Audio, yeah. Yeah.
And my other question is, most IT technologies in the United States are assuming, A, they assume literacy, and B, they're either in English or Spanish. Smaller communities, I think there's a lot less web pages and other sorts of services in their languages. Maybe Chinese. I'm not so sure. I know I've seen lots of Spanish stuff. Did you ask about issues of whether the immigrant populations were literate in English, or whether there were, how successful these service agencies were in providing non-English content?
Yeah, so we are interviewing in English only, and so that's one of the perhaps inherent challenges to getting the full range of the immigrant experience in our work. As far as service providers go, we've been lucky enough to talk to a lot of folks. There's a pretty incredible network that sort of feeds each other. So they have lots of word of mouth and other like city and county agencies that get refugees, asylees, other kinds of immigrants, and then they send them to the different agencies. And I took an amazing picture of yesterday in the Santa Clara County of Immigrant Affairs of the like 24 languages that they support in their office. So it was a pretty impressive list, not big enough for Santa Clara County. There's tons more languages not being served, but there's an impressive amount of work being done with those languages. Yeah.
We're happy to discuss more afterwards if anyone has any other questions that they think of in the meantime. So thank you again for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much.